If there's one thing you take away from this video, it's this. D.Va has 4 main playstyles: marking, diving, peeling, and bunkering. In terms of when to do which playstyle, aggression and ease are the 2 main factors. In other words, if there's an aggressive DPS like a Sojourn or a Soldier on an angle, mark those heroes. If there's a Baptiste or a Zen rotating out in open space, dive that hero because they're easy to kill. If there's an Ana throwing a nade while the monkey jumps in, mark the Ana by eating her nade, then you can peel for your backline. Also, do not waste your boosters. I highly recommend watching that section. D.Va's weapon, the worst shotgun in Overwatch, makes D.Va shoot her twin, short-range, rotating cannons, dealing up to 22 damage per shot, coupled with a 30% movement penalty, a short fall-off range starting at 10 meters, alongside infinite ammo. Likewise to most primaries in the game, there isn't anything too complex about the cannons. You'll use them for basic poking and combining them with micro-missiles. However, Spychecking is really the only unique piece of advice for D.Va's blasters. You can pretty easily search for sombras with your cannons due to them having a wide spread, being hit scan, and having infinite ammo. This is best done on open areas like Watchpoint Gibraltar first point defense, New Junk City with the outside open area point, and to be honest, anywhere on New Queen Street. Lastly, and this is to do with D.Va's mech, do not take too much damage before the beginning of a fight, because you'll limit your options for what you can actually do in the mid-fights. D.Va's first ability, the Boosty Boys, makes D.Va fly at over double her normal speed for 2 seconds with a 3.5 second cooldown. By far and away the most important advice you will hear not just in this video but across D.Va guides on YouTube is to use your boosters intentionally. This will literally change your rank overnight, and it's why I'm dedicating over 5 minutes to this section alone. Here's me and Coffee explaining it. So I think the best way to explain how to properly use D.Va's boosters, that no other guide is going to tell you by the way, is to first off understand how D.Va fundamentally works, how to play into D.Va, and how boosters can sort of counteract that. So on the screen is a professional tier 2 coach called Coffee, who's got a proven track record. He's a very well respected coach, so I'll let him explain it here and then I'll build off it later.
I want you to imagine D.Va with an imaginary circle around her. This circle demonstrates safety for her team or uncontestable ground for the enemy team. With this in mind, everywhere D.Va goes, the circle follows her. It's super important that we keep this in mind, because the simplest of movements should be seen as her making a new area uncontestable. But people don't realize that space acquisition for D.Va is always going to be space sacrifice elsewhere. An aggressive play that uses boosters means that she can't get any new space for at least 4 seconds. This is why we don't see many high level D.Va players moving very far without their space being transferred or replaced by another member of her team. If D.Va's on her backline, hold angles, hold the point, stay far away. Wait, they can't play for the objective if they don't move. And if they do, change angles, leave the point. Make the enemy backline contemplate uninstalling the game.
The big solution here for me is to actually just walk, and it sounds kind of dumb, but pressing W key and actually saving your boosters and making sure you don't waste them for no reason is really important on D.Va, because again, you're going to lose a ton of space if you misuse your boosters. So I'm going to go over some good and bad examples from the most recent pro play. This was from the Esports World Cup 8 days ago, August 6th. This is very relevant, very recent, so we'll get into it. So all Bernard is doing here is pressing W key, moving with cover, forcing the point, just doing basic stuff. He's not wasting his boosters here, which is really important. I will say the forcing point bit here is important because if Bernard just sat on top of his backline, again as Coffee said, Toronto are just going to take angles around Zeta and dive Zeta, and their backline's going to get blown up. Notice here that the Tracer is taking an angle on Bernard. Now, what is Bernard not doing? He's not using his boosters. And how many D.Va players do you know, even yourself watching this video, would booster straight onto the Tracer here? And the reason why is because the Tracer isn't killable. The Tracer's playing far away, and the Tracer isn't really a big threat to Zeta at the moment right now. If Bernard did actually use boosters to go onto the Tracer, that leaves a ton of space down main for someone, Vega, RuPaul, and Merit, to actually get a dive on top of the backline of Zeta, and Bernard couldn't do anything about it because he would have just used boosters to go on top of the Tracer. I will say here there was a slight miscommunication, so he uses boosters right now, but that's mainly because he didn't know that Finn was going to window. If he was staying here with window healing, he could just walk forward and then booster straight onto someone who's already low HP, he's got no jump, he's got no bubble, and that would essentially be a free kill. And that's why boosters are so important. Now Bernard gets healed, and he rinse and repeats. He does the same thing. He's going to force point here with decent cover. Micro missiles are good here, but the really questionable thing that I don't understand is why Bernard uses boosters. Like, that is a really bad boosters. And as you can see, what Toronto do is that they dive and look at what happens. You know, there isn't a D.Va there to mark Merit. Now, in fairness, Bernard didn't know that Merit was actually playing in this sort of cubby hole on the right here. If he did, this is a very killable target. I wouldn't mind him using boosters there. He just didn't know the Ashe was there. But hopefully you can see the principle being in play there. That because Bernard uses boosters, Zeta gives up a ton of space, and I don't know why he boosters this, to be honest. These boosters onto someone are actually great. Why? Because someone is very killable. He's low HP, no bubble, barely any jump pack left. Done. Here's another example of bad booster usage and why it's bad. So here, beginning of the fight, completely fine so far, but for some reason, Bernard boosters up to the Winston, and I don't know what this achieves. I don't know what the intention of boosting up here really is, and you can see how Toronto outplay this. Look at that. That's a tracer that Bernard can't force out because he's already used boosters. Now, this is a bit different than the last example because the tracer is a lot easier to force out. Why? Because the tracer is closer to the D.Va, but Bernard can't force out this tracer because he hasn't got boosters. I will say though, this use of boosters by Bernard right here is actually really good. You can see it right here. Good booster usage. Forces out the tracer recall. That is a good usage of boosters. It's just a shame that it could have been done a bit earlier. To finish it off, here's a prime textbook example of great booster usage. So here, Toronto are going to dive with Pulse Bomb anytime soon right now. There we go, someone jumps in, and you can see Bernard boosters straight onto Merit, plus micro missiles, gets that kill. Absolutely textbook, and the reason why those boosters are good is because Merit is very killable. Merit's playing very close. Bernard's got the micro missiles. Merit is also very dangerous because if Bernard doesn't boost it onto Merit, Merit's going to get a ton of value there. So really important kill by Bernard. Good textbook usage of boosters. Now, in my D.Va guide last year, I did talk about how to choose between marking the enemy DPS, diving the enemy backline, or peeling for your own, and all that advice does still apply. The trick is making sure there's a trigger, or a reason, or an intention with whoever you booster to. If their Widow wastes grapple on high ground, and they're isolated, you can kill them. If an Ashe decides to swing wide while her tank dives in, mark the Ashe. If they're all clumped up, drop on the backline, burn them with missiles, and then fly back to high grounds. If that section was a little bit too dense, I do recommend rewatching it because it's super important D.Va macro that you just won't see elsewhere. If you're Plat, Diamond, or Master, I can already tell you that this is probably what's holding you back. Lastly, a niche use of boosters is for the knockback, to knock heroes off high grounds. It is very niche, but I kinda have to mention it. D.Va's second ability, the mid missiles, makes her fire 18 missiles dealing a total of 153 damage with a cooldown of 7 seconds. As of the writing of this script, it's very likely that D.Va's missiles will be nerfed in the future. The damage of her missiles have been terrorizing the ranked ladder recently. For those who don't know, the combo is self-explanatory. Firstly, use the boosters to close the distance. Secondly, fire your cannons to add a bit of poke damage. Thirdly, fire your missiles when you're actually close to the targets in order to make sure they land. Try not to pop your missiles too early. Lastly, cancel your boosters up close and melee to finish them off. Even when your missiles will get nerfed in the future, this can still pack a big burst damage punch. The last use, which is obviously more niche, is to multitask your missiles alongside your DM. Most commonly, this will be up against Far's Barrage, a Reaper Blossom, or a Cassidy High Noon. The extra damage can make a big difference. D.Va's third ability, the 3.5 second Transcendence, makes D.Va activate a forward-facing targeted array to catch and eliminate projectiles out of the air. The duration is 3.5 seconds, with a 10-meter range and a cooldown of 1 second. It takes 6 seconds to fully charge your Matrix from 0. Let's break Matrix down into a few key uses. The first common use of Matrix is to use it selfishly when boosting or diving in to absorb damage on entry. This is probably the most common usage by far, and it's gonna overlap with some of the other uses. It's great for soft engaging or when you're just walking to take space, kinda like Bernard did in the last section. It's also great for holding space for the same reasons. The second and admittedly obvious use is for Selfless Aggression. If your Pharah wants to barrage, it's standard practice to DM her during the barrage. The same can apply to Blossom, High Noon, or even protecting your Symmetra when she's on high beam charge. Again, it's all about aggression. The third use here is going to be to relieve aggression. This is when their Pharah barrages you. It's when their Tracer wants to hit a pulse bomb, or if their Sojourn wants to pop an overclock, you better be there to eat it. Again, this links back to the whole aggression thing and the whole marking thing with boosters. And lastly, avoid panic matrixing when either a teammate is out of position or when you're out of position. For instance, say your Zen is getting dove by a Tracer, time your Matrix in line for when Tracer finishes her reloads. Here's an example of Bernard, a pro-level D.Va player, wasting his DM a lot and getting punished for it. So again, in the last section we went over the boosters here from Bernard, but this section I want to focus solely on the DM. So again, he boosts up here, DMs a little bit there, makes sense. This DM though, what is he DMing? What, Lucio shots? Winston Tesla Cannon? Kiriko Kunai? There's nothing really of threat that deserves the Matrix here. And it gets even worse because what is he matrixing here, you know? Like, if you're going to be matrixing Sugar Free or you're going to be matrixing Merit, make sure you're actually looking at those targets. But as you can see, once he turns around and looks at these guys, they're not in aggressive positions. Merit is in fucking no man's land, and Sugar Free isn't in an aggressive position to capitalize on Zeto's backline. Like, this DM is completely useless, and as you'll see, as we play the fight here, he's got no DM, and this will bite him back in the ass. And eventually, over time, so he forces out the recall here. As you can see, he's got no DM, and he actually needs it because Merit is in a lethal position, but because he hasn't got enough DM, he gets demeched and has to use Self-Destruct there. So, as you can see, the DM will bite your ass back in the long run as the fight goes on. It's super important to intentionally use it, and not just DM thin air. D.Va's ultimate, Kim Jong-un's secret weapon, makes D.Va self-destruct her mech, dealing up to 1000 damage in a 20-meter radius with a 3-second fuse. Of course, in my last guide, I went over 5 different types of bombs, but they're all kinda niche. Still though, here they are. The first is the angled bomb, which is boosting in the air at a 45-degree angle, then releasing the bomb when just over a quarter of your boosters have been used. Honestly, you should never really do this, because it's only useful for catching squishies off guard. There are some decent spots like this Gibraltar one, so if you want to find more, you can use the workshop code on screen. Secondly is the Nosedive Bomb, just boots into the ground and immediately bomb. Again, I don't really see the use of this in an actual game, but it might be useful if you want to quickly remech. Next up is the air bomb. Simply fly vertically or at a slight lateral angle and detonate your bomb when about half your boosters have been used. This maximizes the coverage of your bomb, and it's decent on open maps like Junkertown. Might be useful for zoning space during overtime. Next up is the Stationery Bomb, which is just standing still, pressing Q. It's not that complex. Funnily enough, you're gonna do this one most of the time, and I'll get into why. And the last niche type of bomb is the drop bomb. This is bombing at the edge of a high ground, then shuffling the bomb with your own hitbox off the edge, which should catch everybody underneath the high grounds. The best examples to do this are when the enemy team are pushing into your space. So for instance, on Gibraltar first point attack, at the very end when the enemy team are trying to touch the point, you can bomb off the high grounds. Another example is on Junkertown second point defense, where the enemy team are likely to be pushing underneath you. Now onto a few do's and don'ts. Don't bomb engage early. Thankfully, it's a dying trend, but the reason why you don't bomb engage early is because it's easy to avoid and you're left without defense matrix, meaning a barrage or blossom can catch you and your team. Do use bomb as a second life. It's very common for top level players to just use bomb like Meteor Strike to allow them to play way more aggressively, and if they get demeched, who the fuck cares? They've got another mech. In fact, you'll be doing this 90% of the time. Don't use bombs to break shield. Hopefully I will never have to say or see this ever again, but some low level D.Va players unironically do this. Please don't. Now into the playstyle section. The most important thing to understand here is that your playstyles can switch dynamically as a teamfight progresses, and that the playstyles can overlap too. I already touched on the playstyles in the booster section, which I highly recommend watching if you skipped it. The first playstyle is peeling, meaning to protect and help your squishies. The key thing here is the range at which you play with regards to your team. You don't want to be stacked on top of your backline, but you also don't want to be isolated from them either. An example I used was on Blizzard World First Points, where you're within a decent range to help anybody. However, let's say in this example, their Genji Winston dive your Ashe on the high grounds. They're also playing an Ana too. What should you do here? Well, here's where it gets a bit complicated and where the second playstyle of marking comes into play. Of course, you should peel the Winston and Genji, but not before you mark the Ana by eating her nade. Then, after you've eaten her cooldowns, you should fly up to the Genji and Winston to punish them and make sure your backline are safe. There's an example of this that I will go through later. You might ask, why not just kill the Ana first? And honestly, that just depends on how killable the Ana is. Generally though, you want to force out flankers and frontline heroes first before you go for backline, and I explain all that in my dive guide. Speaking of diving though, you'll do this playstyle when your team has a lot of space and you have multiple triggers to actually hard engage. Again, a very recent example will be shown later. I spoke a lot about triggers in my Doomfist guide, but in short, you want to have a cooldown advantage, an HP advantage, an ultimate advantage, a numbers advantage, or a positional advantage, or a mixture of any of those in order to actually dive. The last playstyle, bunkering, is a bit more niche and I speak about it in my Brawl guide, so I'm not going to go over it in too much detail here. You can see Bernard do it in this example at the beginning of this fight, but he switches to marking later on. The purpose of bunkering is to mainly absorb dive pressure easier, and it's best done while you're forcing the points. Another visual example is how Spitfire did it against the Houston Outlaws on Antarctic Peninsula. To finish off this section, here's two actual in-game examples from pro play to help solidify these concepts. So this example here, I want you to pay attention to Hattori, and this is going to be really similar to that Blizzard World example that I draw up on screen. And as you can see, Winston jumps in here and look at what Hattori does. She doesn't fly straight to the Winston and just go down main. Instead, she's marking the Ana here, eating the sleep dart, really important eat there, alongside some echo damage. And now after the Ana's got no cooldowns and she feels that the Ana really isn't killable, she's going to turn around and do that peel playstyle. There you go, you can see peeling the Kiriko the best she can. Unfortunately, the Kiriko ends up dying, but she does manage to get the trade onto the Trace there and eventually. Just for reference, Pac really should be forcing out Zodial here on the Tracer instead of trying to go for the backline here. But as you can see in this fight, Hattori does that marking playstyle initially and then switches to that peeling playstyle once she's marked everything that she needs to. The nade, the sleep dart, the echo damage, that kind of stuff. So on to the final example in this video, and this is a super recent one. Again, as you can see, 2 hours here on August 16th, and I want you to pay attention to what Tread does here on the D.Va. So as you can see, he's just forcing frontline, forcing out Hardy, doing a very similar thing to what Bernard was doing back on Colosseo, and that gives him time for Zodial to land a post bomb, and it doesn't stick, but it does hit Sparker, and that gives a trigger for Tread onto the D.Va to actually boost it in onto Funny Astro. Again, the trigger being that he's got a number advantage. He's a 5v4 right now. He's allowed to actually dive in here. But as you'll see, Landon on the Ana does hit a nano boost onto Psycho on the Tracer, and he switches playstyle. He does that peeling playstyle now, and he's going to shut down Psycho the best he can. DM is decent there. Probably want a little bit more DM here if I'm being honest, but the boosters are good, the marker missiles are good, forces out the recall, really textbook classic D.Va play. Now on to D.Va's tag matchups. D.Va vs Doomfist. Doom can't hold space as well as Winston can, so if you're able to force a frontline duel, that's going to go heavily in your favour. It's kinda like playing D.Va into Winston, but the trade-off is that Doomfist has much higher burst damage, and a defense matrix isn't going to do much to an empowered punch. Instead, try and mark other targets on the Doom's team, and avoid feeding him punch with your missiles. D.Va vs Queen. You actually have a decent frontline matchup into her. Queen hasn't got any armor, so you can burst her down, you can eat her knives fairly easily, and Queen's damage into you is halved because of your armor. Forcing out Shao is pretty key here, but don't get carried away shooting the Queen. Remember, your angle control is still much better than hers, but of course, if she's on top of your backline, a Matrix might help. D.Va vs Orisa. Orisa wants to do her spear spin fortify spear spin cycle to gain space for her team. When she does that, ignore her. Focus on marking the Reaper, the Genji, the Ashe, or whoever's getting value out of the space she's creating. Abuse high grounds and abusing distance can also help a bunch as well. The same advice also applies to Mauga. Of course, the obvious tip here is to save your Matrix for his Cardiac Overdrive, because you can pretty much eat all of it. So if he's inting onto your backline, Matrix his ass and burn him. D.Va vs Ramattra. The only thing you can eat from Ram is the Vortex and his Omnic form of fire. Knowing that, the Ramattra will look to barrel down on top of his squishy, and there's not too much you can do about it. You also lose that frontline duel as well. Instead, you want to make that Ramattra contemplate running on top of your team. If you're on high ground on top of his backline, he has to force you out, which inherently creates space for your team. D.Va vs Reinhardt. Get your ass off the low ground as D.Va. Of course, eat his fire strikes, but you have way better angle control than the Reinhardt, so abuse it. He'll probably try to pin your backline, in which case, just Matrix him off from the rest of his team, and you can burn him from behind. D.Va vs Roadhog. Don't bother burning the Hog unless he's killable. Play like a fat tracer, harassing the teammates around the Hog that he can't really help out. Of course, if you can, Matrix his hooks and his whole Hog. D.Va vs Sigma. The same advice applies just as I've said to the majority of the ground tanks. It's super hard for Sigma to directly involve himself if you're 2v1ing someone on the flank, or if you're sat on high ground marking the squishies. D.Va vs Winston. I've already gone over this in decent detail from the booster section and the playstyle section as well, but in short, you have the better frontline matchup on D.Va. Force the point with cover, force out the Winston with micro missiles, and don't use your boosters unless you see something killable and or something that's highly dangerous. D.Va vs Bull. Again, you can't Matrix his pole driver, but you can Matrix his teammates who will try to get value when he slams. When he's got mines, also look to kite back to high ground where possible. D.Va vs Zarya. People always think Zarya is the counter to D.Va, but again, the key is verticality. Yeah, no shit, Zarya's gonna beat you if you're sitting in front of her the entire time. Marking and diving are probably the most relevant playstyles here, and Zarya has some of the lowest mobility in the game, so you shouldn't need to worry about her controlling your angles. Well, that's it for the video. I'm busy reworking my tank guides because most of them are kinda mid now, but if you enjoyed, and if this video helped to raise your IQ, be sure to share it with your friends to also raise theirs. Until next time.